Welcome to School of Pop, where curiosity meets pop culture. I'm Kat Monroe, your host and study buddy in all things entertainment. And this semester, we're exploring the ethics of being a fan. Y/N, wait, he calls out, jogging to catch up with you. You pause, heart pounding as he steps closer, rain dripping from his curls. What is it, you whisper? He hesitates, biting his lip before finally saying, I can't stop thinking about you, love. I know this is crazy, but... Okay, enough of the cringe. In today's lesson, we're looking at how fandom has transformed from passive enjoyment to active creation. From fan fiction and fan edits to bootleg merch and AI-generated covers, fans have been blurring the lines between creativity, legality, and ethics for decades. But as fan culture grows and technology evolves, so do the questions around ownership, artistic boundaries, and whether fan creation should be considered harmless tributes or outright theft. In middle school, I loved logging on to Wattpad and reading silly fan fictions or imagines about my favorite artists. That kind of inspired our very embarrassing to say intro. But like One Direction, Fifth Harmony, Austin Mahone, 5 Seconds of Summer, and the MagCon boys. Yes, that era. If you know, you know. If you don't, please do not judge. And I would not recommend looking it up. It was truly an era, a time that is like capsuled off in that era. But it was hilarious to look back on. Like, if you were 13 at that time, like, we were living. It was fun. But looking at it all, I think there's some really important questions to explore about as it relates to this whole world of fan-created content, between what's legal, what's ethical, and what happens when fan projects become so big that they challenge the very industries that inspired them. Now, we won't be just talking about fan fiction. Obviously, there's so many things in the space of fan-created media. And to help us break it all down, I'll be joined by Kirk Sigmon, an intellectual property attorney who specializes in copyright and internet piracy, to get the legal perspective on where fan content stands in today's entertainment landscape. But before we dive in, it's time for your school announcements, aka your pop recap, where we break down the latest trending news and entertainment. First off, Beyonce has kicked off her Cowboy Carter tour officially, and you guys, it looks amazing. It looks so good. I feel like the set list leans heavily on the Cowboy Carter album, obviously, and for someone who loves Cowboy Carter probably just an inch more than Renaissance, I cannot complain. And she's also throwing in a few throwbacks too, so it's just a really strong set. I also have to say, I think it's beautiful how Beyonce is incorporating her daughters into her show. She's been bringing her daughters, if you haven't seen, Rumi and Blue Ivy on stage. It's just the sweetest thing to see. And can we talk about Blue Ivy's dancing? Because she is absolutely killing it out there. Just so poised and talented. And watching her we've kind of watched her grow from Renaissance tour into now just being like a super confident performer. And yeah, my whole TikTok has just been filled with so many videos from this tour. So I can't wait to maybe check it out later this summer. I haven't seen Beyonce in concert since like 2018. So I am long overdue, but this tour looks so good. Switching to the theater world, the 2025 Tony Award nominations are out, and there's a lot to be excited about here. Leading with 10 nominations each are Buena Vista Social Club, Death Becomes Her, and Maybe Happy Ending. These shows are definitely making waves and totally ones to check out this season. I haven't seen any of them yet. I know Maybe Happy Ending is like my most anticipated to watch, so I definitely need to make a trip up. I would say that's my prediction for Best Musical, but we will see. Those are the top 3. And then, of course, with every award season, there are some snubs and surprises, and I wanted to chat about some of the bigger snubs because notably Denzel Washington and Jake Gyllenhaal, they were overlooked for their performances in Othello, which, despite breaking box office records, didn't receive a single nomination. Similarly, Kieran Culkin missed out on a nod for Glengarry Glen Ross, even though his co-star Bob Odenkirk was recognized. And some other notable omissions that people are talking about include Idina Menzel for Redwood, Rachel Zegler and Kit Connor for Romeo and Juliet, and Nick Jonas and Adrienne Warren for that revival of the last 5 years that recently opened. On the brighter side, celebrating some of the other performers that got nominated, we have George Clooney and Nicole Scherzinger, who both received their very first Tony Award nominations for Good Night and Good Luck and Sunset Boulevard, respectively. And then we've got to talk about Audra McDonald. She made history, becoming the most Tony-nominated performer in Broadway history after getting her 11th nomination this year for her role in Gypsy. What's cool about this is that it's also just over 10 years since she became the most awarded performer in Tony history with 6 wins. She got that back in 2014. So she's just breaking records left and right. Obviously, she's a huge talent. So congratulations to her and everyone else who got nominated for a Tony this year. As a reminder, the Tony Awards will be broadcast live from Radio City Music Hall on Sunday, June 8th, airing on CBS and streaming on Paramount+. It's all hosted by Cynthia Erivo, so it's gonna be incredible. I cannot wait to check it out. That's all for today's Pop Recap. For more entertainment news, join the class roster by subscribing to the Pop Recap newsletter at poprecap.beehiiv.com. That's poprecap.beehiiv.com. New editions released on the final Sunday of each month. Fan-created media is everywhere. If you've ever read fan fiction, watched an edit on TikTok, bought unofficial merch on Etsy, or even laughed at an AI-generated cover of your favorite artist, you've seen firsthand how fan culture has moved beyond just consuming content to actively creating it. For a long time, fan works existed in sort of a gray area. Technically unauthorized, but mostly tolerated as long as they weren't interfering with the profits or reputation of the original creators. But as these projects gained mainstream attention and even made money, they've also attracted legal scrutiny. So today, we're diving into the question, where's the line between fan appreciation and copyright infringement? What's legal, what's ethical, and what happens when fans push the boundaries too far? One of the biggest examples of this in recent years is the Bridgerton musical lawsuit. If you somehow missed it, this all started as a TikTok project by Abigail Barlow and Emily Bear, who began writing songs inspired by the extremely popular Netflix series Bridgerton in 2021. The concept went viral, and eventually they turned it into an official album, which they called the Unofficial Bridgerton Musical. The two young musicians even won the Grammy for Best Musical Theater Album in 2022. But things took a turn when they staged a full live concert at the Kennedy Center, selling tickets and profiting off of an IP owned by Netflix. Netflix had originally tolerated the project, but later sued the duo, arguing that they had crossed the line into profiting off of copyrighted material without permission. The streaming giant said Barlow and Bear had taken valuable intellectual property from the Netflix original series Bridgerton to build an international brand for themselves. This case raised some big questions. When does a fan project stop being just for fun and become an IP violation? Should studios embrace fan creations or protect their work at all costs? And how do platforms like TikTok, which help these projects gain traction, fit into the legal conversation? Another example of fan works breaking into the mainstream is fan fiction turned published novels. If you've heard of After by Anna Todd or 50 Shades of Grey by E.L. James, then you know how big these stories can become. What's interesting is that both started as fan fiction. After was originally a One Direction fan fiction on Wattpad, while 50 Shades got its start as a Twilight fan fiction. Both stories were later rewritten with original characters and published as best-selling books. Now, some people argue that this is a smart way for writers to get discovered and that these stories should be seen as creative transformations. There are many writers who got their starts writing fan fiction and then pivoted into their own creations. Others argue that fan fiction based on real people, like the original After, that raises ethical concerns. Is it okay to write highly romanticized or even explicit stories about real celebrities? And how much can you change before something stops being fan fiction and starts infringing on intellectual property? Then we have fan edits, whether they're aesthetic video montages, remixed trailers, altered movie posters, parodies, or even AI covers that we're starting to see on TikTok. They've all long been a staple of online fandom culture. But where is the line between creative appreciation and disrespecting the original artist's intent? A recent example where we saw this play out is last year in Cynthia Erivo's response to a fan-made Wicked poster that altered the official film design. The Broadway musical's original poster hides Elphaba's eyes and features her wearing red lipstick with a smirk. However, the movie version featuring Erivo had her looking directly at the viewer with green lipstick instead. When a fan edited the movie poster to mimic the Broadway version, covering Erivo's eyes and changing the color palette, she called it out as offensive. In a series of Instagram stories, she explained, "The original poster is an illustration. I am a real-life human being who chose to look right down the barrel of the camera to you, the viewer, because without words, we communicate with our eyes. Our poster is a homage, not an imitation. To edit my face and hide my eyes is to erase me, and that is just deeply hurtful." Cynthia Erivo later reflected on this moment, telling Entertainment Tonight, "I'm passionate about it, and I know the fans are passionate about it, and I think for me, it was just like a human moment of wanting to protect little Elphaba, and it was like a human moment." But this does raise interesting questions about fan engagement with official media. Are fan edits always a harmless way to express admiration, or can they sometimes cross a line into misrepresentation or even erasure of the artist's creative vision? We see this a lot throughout fan culture when fans call out creative decisions. For example, a major character right now just got killed off on the popular series 911, and a lot of fans are saying, why did they do this? They're calling it out and they're complaining. And this always happens when big choices are made with movie and television franchises. But we also see it with fan-created media as well. And with the increasing use of AI and digital manipulation, we want to know, how much control do artists and creators truly have over how their work is perceived? Because this is such a quickly changing environment, and I think is really interesting. With all of these examples in mind, today's lesson, the goal is about untangling the legal, ethical, and creative questions that surround fan-created media. How much creative freedom do fans really have? When does something cross the line into legal obligations or copyright infringement? And with the rise of AI and digital content creation, where's all of this headed? To begin breaking it down, I spoke with Kirk Sigmon to help us separate myth from fact when it comes to copyright laws and fan creations. Kirk Sigmon is a partner at the law firm Banner and Witkoff Ltd. In Washington, D.C., where he specializes in all forms of intellectual property prosecution and litigation across the world. Kirk has written numerous legal publications about fan works, copyright, and internet piracy. Thank you so much for joining me. The first question I wanted to know a little bit more about is this idea of fair use. I feel like it's one of those terms that's widely used, but it's often misunderstood. What would you say are the biggest myths or misconceptions that you've seen specifically around fair use? And how do you think that confusion may impact fans that are trying to create content legally?
Sure. Yeah. So fair use is kind of interesting because it's become this weird, magical spell that people think they can incite on YouTube or on fan websites to somehow justify what they're doing. And the reality of it is it's a very specific thing that candidly doesn't always apply to what you're doing. So let me kind of zoom back a little bit and talk about what that actually means. So fair use is a defense to a copyright lawsuit. So if someone, some Disney or some other big company sues you for copyright infringement, then you can use fair use as a defense. Fair use does not prevent you from being sued. And oftentimes, if you're citing fair use, you're basically saying that I want to have a fight over whether or not what I used was proper, the substance of what I did, whether or not it was parody or things like that. So it's a situation that you don't want to be in the very first place because you don't want to be sued. And so it's kind of funny because you'll see on YouTube, some creators love to say things like, oh, this is a fair use, and that's what this is, 17 USC 107. And it doesn't work that way. It's something that you have to use when you've gotten sued. And you can use it as a guidepost for understanding what you can and cannot do on websites, again, like YouTube or on your own website or on fan fiction websites, for example. But that doesn't mean it's a protective aspect. In general, what fair use basically says, for the purposes of fan fiction and things like that at least, is that parody and review are fair. Parody is kind of a tough one, but in general, you are free to review content. You're free to say you liked a movie, you didn't like a movie. That sometimes can go as far as allowing you to use clips to describe why you did or did not like something. But the reality of it is not a license to go use someone else's content, for example, for the purposes of making a side story, for the purposes of just being a fan. Unfortunately, that's just not covered. Fair use is a very specific thing, and candidly, you don't want to be in a situation where you're using it.
That's really insightful. And you know, when you say parody, I kind of think of those viral videos from the mid 2010s where people would take an instrumental and then come up with crazy lyrics to put over the original song. But obviously, parody encompasses so many different things. Can you speak to what falls under the idea of parody?
Oh yeah, parody can be, it's really hard to define because the actual books that help explain the court rulings on this are multiple volumes long, so distilling it down is really hard to explain. But one way to think about it is parody is you saying, I'm going to make fun of something and I'm trying to sort of critique it or make a statement that is above and beyond the original work. And I'm hyper simplifying things, so this is not necessarily, something you should go take to a lawsuit, but I'm kind of giving you the basic idea, which is, let's say, for example, you're making a parody song with the same beat. You could argue that that's parody for sure, but the problem is that you have to show that the parody is again, fair use of that work. And sometimes that wouldn't count, right? There's a good question as to whether or not those songs could use a different, backing track, if they could use a different melody, things like that. So parody is very limited in the sense that if you want to make a classical argument of parody, you're going to have to show that, for example, you are critiquing or reviewing or sort of making a comment about the original work. And that's kind of difficult. So to kind of put things in comparison, just using someone else's content for the purposes of saying, well, it's famous and I'm going to rewrite the lyrics a little bit, that's actually quite more difficult than you would think. Parody in the classical sense that you could probably get away with would be a bit closer to the argument of saying, I'm going to make a spoof of Star Wars that sort of makes fun of the fact that it's a little bit silly here and there. And that's an example I'm using, like that old movie Spaceballs. I'm using all those old like parody, on old school, Saturday Night Live and things like that. That's a bit closer to what they're looking for because they're making a comment about the quality of that work. They're sort of having some sort of normative statement about what's going on there. In the contrast, just using clips of Star Wars and trying to attack, say, a politician might be a little bit harder, right? It's a little bit harder of an argument because you're not making a statement about that work. You're kind of just using it. So it's a bit more complicated than you think.
Yes, that totally makes sense. I guess it's about not necessarily remixing something, but really making it something that brings a whole new statement or idea to the plate.
Right.
Something else I've always been curious about is that sometimes I'm able to walk into a store like Walmart and see a whole bookshelf section just filled with Taylor Swift books. And I could assume some of them got official green lights to legally publish them, but some also note on their covers that they're unauthorized. I wanted to ask, what legal factors allow these products to exist, and is labeling something unauthorized enough to keep it within legal bounds?
So to quickly answer your second question first, the basic answer is that putting something unauthorized on there doesn't do you a lot of good. But those are very interesting, those sort of fan books and those fan publications, magazines, things like that. Generally speaking, it is not copyright infringing to talk about facts, right? If we're talking about Taylor Swift saying her birthday is this date, saying where she lives, as creepy as that might be, talking about her life and how she became to be a pop star, things of that nature, those are arguably facts. And you can describe those facts in a creative way, which means that you can write prose, you can make images and flowcharts and things like that to try to describe what's going on there. And that's creative. But the underlying facts are not. And that means that if you are a publisher who wants to make some sort of fan work, describing that work is not necessarily, a bad thing. But where it gets dicey is when you're using content in there that might be copyrighted. So needless to say, if I'm copying her song lyrics, well, there might be a problem. If I'm stealing someone else's photographs of Taylor Swift and putting them on there, well, sure, that's also a problem. And on and so forth. So those books and those magazines, oftentimes, when they're not just outright, given the permission by the original owners of the copyright, what they're doing is they're collecting their own work and using the fact that they're describing facts and using the fact that what's in there is their own prose, their own photographs, or at least licensed photographs for the purposes of justifying what they've done. And it still is a very legally dicey area, right? I mean, it's one of those situations where those types of books can oftentimes get in trouble because not only are they, possibly running up against copyright concerns, but there are also in various states what's called a right to publicity and a sort of false light privacy and things like that. So there are lines drawn in different states about what you can and cannot say about people. Of course, I could not go in those books and say something like, she's a mass murderer, because that would be libel, right? That would be factually incorrect. So there's a lot of lines drawn in the sand above and beyond copyright those books have to tread. But nonetheless, the basic answer is they're very careful.
Another thing I wanted to ask about, fans will create and sell their own merch, putting song lyrics or logos on shirts to sell on Etsy or their own shops. And for For example, Disney. It's one company that I see it a lot with, where Disney is a company that is so protective of its brand, and yet there's so many people that are selling logos or t-shirts with Mickey ears everywhere on them on Etsy, and I'm always wondering, that can't be allowed, right?
It's really tough for those companies because they want to encourage fans to be fans, right? If you're Disney, if you're Nintendo, if you're these big brands, the last thing you want to do is make an enemy of your fans. And that's very important to realize, because that means that even if you see someone doing something that otherwise might be unlawful, that doesn't necessarily mean you go sue them. And that's a lot of what's animating those issues with Etsy and places like that is, yes, absolutely, they are trying to, they being Disney, these major corporations, have a right to and do in fact try to shut down unauthorized use of their copyright, trademark, whatever. The reality, however, is that it's very hard to keep track of that on a regular basis because there's so many people doing it at any given time. And at the same time, they don't want to look bad. They don't want to be a jerk and go threaten to sue everyone who comes out of the woodwork who's just a fan who's trying to do something. And what's interesting about that is that it has struck an interesting balance online where most of those companies, though they could sue, draw we'll say a blind eye towards uses of stuff for fans, right? So if you go on DeviantArt nowadays, you still see tons of fan art that, sure, it's probably derivative of in some ways. It probably could be shut down if you had to. But realistically, those companies are going to go, oh, you know what? It's just some fan who's really into Mario. Let's let him do what he wants to do. It doesn't hurt us. And that's how it's been for a very long time. The Etsy situation is where it gets very complicated because then you've got fans who are making money. And yes, there's not a major distinction for that in a trademark and copyright perspective. They have the right to stop you regardless of whether or not you're making money. However, it does matter from a practical standpoint where they look at the situation and they go, you know what? I wouldn't mind if you're just being a fan and making your own Mickey Mouse ears. But now that you're selling them to other people instead of us selling Mickey Mouse ears, now I have a problem. And that's where that sort of problem arises. That's why there's that tension there.
That makes sense. I'm always seeing so much of it, and I'm always curious what's happening legally in that space. Going back to our discussion on parody earlier, a few years ago, Netflix filed a lawsuit against two TikTokers after they created what they called the unofficial Bridgerton musical. Netflix argued in the case that the creators that conducted their musical had stretched fan fiction past its breaking point. And it was because they did a live performance, they made money, they won Grammys, and it made me think there's many cases where fan fiction starts as a passion project, but then crosses into the professional world, whether that be going from a book on a free fan site to being professionally published for profit, or even turned into a movie franchise. What legal lines do fan fiction writers need to be aware of in cases where their work might transition from a free hobby to something more profitable?
Sure. So like I said before, in general, creators, that is to say copyright holders and trademark owners and people like that, do have the right to stop you whether or not you're making money. But again, pragmatically speaking, they're not necessarily going to be interested in punishing you for being a fan. So the reality of it is that companies like Netflix have to balance between wanting people to be passionate fans of TV shows like Bridgerton and the practical issue that they don't want you making money off of it, especially when, even if you call something unofficial, you are arguably leveraging on the popularity of what they have created to make money, make fame, get a Grammy, etc. And it seems unfair in that way, but that's just sort of the practical reality of it, is that they want to stop you from using them as a stepping stool to some sort of success that you would otherwise would not have had. And so with the situation with the Bridgerton musical, no one would have stopped them if it was a generic, Regency era musical that didn't use the name Bridgerton, that you didn't use the same characters and so forth. The problem there is that they didn't do that because they knew that there was some cachet to the name Bridgerton, that there was some cachet to the power of being associated with a very wildly trending TV show. And so from Netflix's perspective, it's not just a fan being really into Bridgerton and making something that shows how much they're into it, but rather someone making a musical because they know people like Bridgerton, they'll watch this. They won't watch, some random Jane Eyre style musical, but they sure as hell will tune into something that says Bridgerton. And that's where usually that line arises. So for the fans, what that means in translation is you are always at risk of them coming after you if you do something you don't like. And an example I'll provide you is many companies that are sort of famous copyright owners, right? So your Nintendos of the world, your Disneys of the world, etc., have increasingly begun to go after fan fiction that they consider to be too sexualized. And the reason for that, of course, is they don't want their stuff associated with that, right? They don't want their brands to be sort of marred by something creepy on the internet. So even though you're not selling it, even if it's just in the internet for you, some of those brands are beginning to shut that down because they don't want to be affiliated with it. And so that risk is always there. But the practical reality is you probably are fine just being a fan if you're making your own drawings, if you're showing off how much of a fan you are about something. Needless to say, that balance begins to shift for most companies when you are making money, when you're using them as a stepping stone, when you're beginning to popularize yourself off of it. And there's a lot of different ways that could happen. But the basic way to think about it is there's nothing wrong with being a fan. Most companies are okay with it. You're not perfectly protected, but the real issues begin to kick in when it's very obvious that there is a financial aspect to it, or that you have a real risk of tarnishing their brand or sort of taking over their brand in any way.
What about in cases where instead of a fan fiction being about a movie or a fictional character, that it's written about or inspired by a real person or celebrity? Are there any added protections or rules that fans have to follow in these cases, like slight modifications or name changes if it's professionally published?
So in general, the rule of thumb is that you are allowed to be inspired by other things, be it real life facts or creative works. So the phrase that is sometimes used in the intellectual property world is that we stand on the shoulders of giants. In translation, what that means is that if you make a story, whether fictional or nonfiction, whether you're purporting it to be nonfictional, you can do that with based upon real historical facts. You can do that as inspired by real people. You can do that as inspired by other works, like a book you read, a video game you played, and so forth. That's all fair game. Where it gets dicey is, of course, when you're talking about real people or you're using the same characters from another book or something like that. That's where it gets troublesome, right? Because at that point, on one hand, if it's a real person, you get into questions about whether or not what you're doing is libelous or you're violating some state rights issues. Like I mentioned, that false light privacy sort of concept. On the other side of it is if you're using fictional work, like if I want to make a Harry Potter spinoff, if I'm using those characters, then that's arguably copyright infringement. Now, the cases involving that are very complicated, but the basic idea is you can't do that, right? I couldn't go and make, Harry Potter 2, right? That wouldn't make any sense. So what that means in translation is there are ways in which you can be inspired by things, be it creative or otherwise, and make good works that succeed. Oftentimes, a smart move is you have to change the names at minimum. You can't have the same names. You cannot realistically argue that one person living right now has a fiat on what we call the hero's journey, or these basic tropes that you see in most stories, or the idea of magical wizards and things like that. We're all too old for that, or at least we're too modern for that. So there's ways to get around it.
Right, that makes sense. Shifting gears a bit, I want to talk about artificial intelligence and how AI-generated content is absolutely shaking up the fan space. Whether it be deep fake videos or AI covers, I wanted to know what legal protections currently exist and if you think that laws are starting to pick up with how fast this technology is advancing.
So this area is extremely dangerous because it's well known that it has a lot of traps for both creators, copyright holders, and the people who are using AI. And the reality of it is it's probably going to be very dangerous to use AI for that sort of content coming in the future. Just the reality of it is, celebrities don't want their voices misused. Companies don't want their content misused, and they're going to be very angry if they're not able to protect it. So as it stands right now, and as I understand it, because this area is moving very quickly, it's not really a decided thing as to whether or not using AI to generate something, like if I go to ChatGPT and make it, make an image, if that's enough to be considered copyright infringing, because there are bazillions of images in that system. It's been trained for years. Candidly speaking, it's a bit more too attenuated for anyone to say that that particular AI-generated image was generated based upon a specific previous work. However, when you were talking about using, say, models of celebrity voices or art models for, generative AI models that are made to just emulate certain artist styles. So, for example, there are some AI models that sort of paint the same way that certain painters do and so forth. Then you get dangerous because at that point, you have specifically told the model, I want you to emulate this specific thing. And the infringement case there is a hell of a lot easier to make. You can make that argument way easier because you say, look, even if it was trained based upon 6 billion different images, this model has specifically been told, I want you to create something just like these copyrighted images. So from a copyright law perspective, we would say there's a very good argument to be made that what you have generated with AI is called a derivative work. And that gets really dicey. So in other words, what I've told people before is it's extremely risky. And the reality of it is that there's going to be a very big fight about this. There already is, candidly, but in the next couple of years. And people using AI to make, deep fakes, to make similar art, they're probably not going to win it as well as they want to. So if you're a creative or if you're a fan and if you're using this content, you've got to understand that the likelihood of this being found infringing is extremely high. And if I were you, I would not go try to sell it or misuse it. Chances are I would just not do it if I can avoid it. But that's kind of my take on it so far.
Yeah, it's definitely really concerning. Like, I've been on TikTok and I just see it'll say it's one song by one artist and they're using the voice of another artist to sing it, but it sounds exactly like that artist. It's just so crazy to me how accurate they can get with this AI stuff. So I'm really interested to see how things move in that space going forward.
It's a very big problem. I mean, no one really has a good answer for it, candidly. I mean, let's be real, it's going to be very complicated going forward. But the blunt reality of it is there's not going to be an easy answer. And I would not want to be the kind of person who would be vulnerable to be sued. So, if you're someone who's very passionate about some artist's style, for example, if we're talking about a painter, one of the better things you can do is just go learn how to paint like them. And then you can argue that you made it yourself and you were inspired, and maybe it's a bit of an easier argument. What I would not do if I were you is to go use an AI model to make the same thing, because then the infringement argument's way, way, way more dangerous for you.
Now, I saw you have some experience specifically with gaming, and I was curious because in that space, whether it be modding or even resurrecting old games, like I did a podcast episode a little while ago where I saw some Flash-based games that I grew up playing as a kid. Companies abandoned them, and then fans had recreated their own versions and put them online. I wanted to know, how have you seen the law treat these sorts of cases and whether fan projects like that could ever fall under the idea of cultural preservation?
So that's an argument I've actually made before, but I'll give you the easier answer and the legal scholar answer, because I know that's not very helpful. The reality is we are too new as a society that has video games. The video games themselves are too new for us to realistically argue that a lot of copyrights have been truly abandoned. There are some exceptions to that. There are some ways around that. But the basic way to think about it is this entire world of video games is far too new for us to argue that anything's truly abandonware. Hear people use that term. There's reasons they use that term. Maybe the copyright's lost in the ether to somebody, but there's a fair argument to be made that someone still owns the copyright to all these old Flash games somewhere along the line. They might not enforce it, but they have it. So the blunt reality of it is you have to be kind of careful. Like, again, companies do not want to shoot their fans for being fans. You don't want to discourage people for being passionately interested in, say, an old school video game. And so you don't want to piss them off. But the reality of it is, these companies do have the right to stop you from doing it. And modding is an interesting issue because most companies are now very aware of that. And they try, at least, to put in the contract provisions of the games, like the terms of use or whatever they end up calling it, restrictions of what you can and cannot do with modifications to video games. And there are some games that are coming out pretty soon here that are going to test that very aggressively, because some companies have gone as far as to say, I don't want anyone modifying this. And most of the internet has said, haha, good luck on that one. Because you can't control it, really. But the reality of it is you would have to control it by suing people. And maybe those people in the United States, maybe they're not. So all this is all to say that it's an area where the reality of it is there are still people out there with copyright interests, with the rights to code, with things like that. And there's oftentimes a lot of misunderstanding about the scope of those rights. But the reality of it is someone has that power and they can sue you. If I'm a fan, I would do the same thing as I mentioned with art, music, or anything else like that. You can realize that what you're creating is subservient to their copyright interests, their trademark interests, and candidly, the terms of use of whatever you end up agreeing to. And realize that if you're creating something, you have a very limited right to whatever you've done. That's unfortunately the nature of being a fan. And I would be very careful. I would not try to purport to sell anything, because that would definitely piss them off. And I would realize that, I'm in an uncomfortably, we'll say, submissive position where I have to make sure that they don't get angry, because if they do, they can really stop me.
This conversation has been really fascinating. Before we wrap up, is there anything else about fair use, fan creativity, or legal risks that you think fans should know?
The biggest thing I've seen with a lot of folks who are creators is that given the speed and the content available on the internet, it's very tempting just to grab stuff and go. And there are plenty of creators who do that, right? I understand. I'm not unaware of the fact that if I go to YouTube right now, there are plenty of websites, or rather plenty of videos and plenty of associated projects and plenty of different kind of pieces of content that totally steal from other people, right? I can probably go click right now on the front page of YouTube on my YouTube and find someone using video game music in the background of some asinine video, regardless of whether or not it's affiliated with that video game. And that's a bit of a problem, because to some degree, what that means in translation is that they are technically infringing that music, whether or not it's in the background or not. And I know that that's very much a common thing. It sucks, but it's a reality. If I'm in your shoes, I would be aware that you should not be doing that. Whether you do that or not, it's up to you. Like, I can't stop you. No one can stop you. But you have to realize that when you do create works that use other people's stuff, you are vulnerable to being sued. Even if it's a stupid image, even if it's in the background, even if it's sort of inconsequential to what you're doing. And that puts you at risk. So if you're a fan, you need to be realizing that, like, whatever you're creating, either you're going to have to accept the risk, you're going to have to accept the risk that the original copyright owner come after you, or you can try the other opportunity, which is to use sort of non-copyrighted, free to use, public domain works, whatever you call them, exclusively. And that decision is up to you, like where you think you're going to be safe. But the reality of it is everyone's doing it. It's tough. I realize more than anyone that the copyright system probably needs to be fixed. But for now, we can't fix it for you. That's going to take probably a decade or more. So for now, just be aware of those risks, realize where you are and are not using other people's work, and make those choices strategically. If you're going to make those choices, realize that someone can sue you at some point and just prepare for it.
That's all really, really important advice. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you.
So we've just heard from Kirk Sigmon about the legal side of fan-created media, what's technically allowed, what crosses into copyright infringement, where all the blurry lines are, and how the law interprets fan work. But beyond the legalities, there's still a bigger question at play. Just because something can be done doesn't mean that it should be. This is where we step into the gray area of ethics, because even when something isn't illegal, it can still be controversial or make the artists themselves uncomfortable. Fan-created media exists in this strange middle ground between appreciation and overstepping in control. To me, there are some things in the fan creation world that may technically be okay to do, but just don't seem right. For example, writing a fan fiction about a fictional character, that's generally acceptable. But what about writing a fan fiction about a real person? Is it harmless fun, or does it cross a boundary into projection? Personally, I think it can depend on the context. Some celebrities do say they find these types of fan works to be amusing, like Billie Eilish, who once revealed that she reads fan fictions about herself and even had the Wattpad app downloaded on her phone. And then we see like Niall Horan. He's done interviews where he's read fan fictions and laughed and read out these dramatic things in interviews, and he engages with the fandom's creativity in a lighthearted way. But not every artist feels the same. Many distance themselves entirely, especially when the stories take on a life of their own. For me, the ethical concerns come in when these stories or edits start creating a personality, an image, or a narrative for a real person that doesn't reflect who they actually are. Now, obviously, with celebrities, like, we don't really know them, but I think when it becomes like very projected on very negative things, that's when it starts to become a problem. A lot of fan fiction, especially real person fan fiction, it falls into the romance genre and can get extremely sexualized or dramatic. At a certain point, I think it's worth asking, does this cross a line? Because if I were a celebrity, I'd feel uncomfortable knowing there was a viral fan fiction of me doing things completely out of character, especially if it was explicit. So I think it's important to ask, at what point does it stop being entertainment and start becoming invasive? I think that's ultimately what you have to ask yourself before deciding to put something out about someone that you don't personally know. In other cases, sometimes appreciation is truly well-meaning, but may not land well for the other side. With the Cynthia Erivo example we gave earlier about the Wicked fan-made poster, the artist wasn't trying to be disrespectful. In their mind, they were honoring both the Broadway history of the show and Erivo's role. But as we've learned throughout our semester already, intent doesn't always equal impact. The edited poster stripped away an intentional artistic choice, and for Erivo, it felt like an erasure of her identity and the work she put in to make the character of Elphaba her own. The same can be said for AI-generated fan content, especially the ones where you use AI to have one artist cover another artist's song or completely make up a song for an artist to sing. Those kind of clips can sound very realistic. Like I said, it's always scary to me almost. And some fans, they see this as fun, fictionalized creations. But from the perspective of the artist involved, it can feel dehumanizing or exploitative. For example, Selena Gomez commented on an AI video that had her voice singing a version of the Weeknd song Starboy, and she said, "That's scary." I'm personally in agreement with Selena Gomez here. Those are so creepy to me. Even though I'll shamelessly admit that before the Tortured Poets department came out, there was this AI version of Taylor Swift's Fortnite that went viral on TikTok. And it wasn't the real version. It was like an estimation of what it would sound like. And it was pretty catchy. But you know what? I prefer to hear the real art from the real person. It's just odd to me how accurate they can sound and how you know that AI could never truly replace the creative mind of that person, and yet it still tries and people still continue to make these kinds of videos. So our lesson today, fan-created media is a reflection of passion, creativity, and community. But with that comes responsibility. Whether it's legal concerns or ethical boundaries, being mindful of the impact of what we create matters. Artists inspire fans, and fans in turn shape culture in ways that can be both exciting and complicated. At the end of the day, appreciation should never come at the cost of respect. At its best, fan work has opened doors for so many. It's helped people find their creative voice, launch careers. You hear stories of people that ran update accounts become marketing coordinators or marketing managers in the music industry for record labels. You hear stories of people getting their start making fan edits of their favorite movies and then really starting to edit movies and work in that industry, whether that be building out a fandom graphic design portfolio and then using that to get a real job in that industry, or getting your start, as we said, writing fan fiction and becoming a real published author. I think there is opportunity for growth and connection when we create about the things that we love, but it's so important to do it with thought and with care and respect and knowledge to what is legal and what is not. A special huge thank you again to Kirk Sigmon for joining us and helping to break down the legal side of this conversation. And speaking of money, we touched a little bit on the business side of fan culture today, and next week we're going to dive in even deeper. From ticket prices to fan merch and everything in between, we'll be discussing the financial aspects of being a fan. This is an episode that I am very excited about because I had a lot to learn, so I'm sure you will too. Until then, I want to hear from you and this week's discussion board. What are your thoughts on fan-created media? Have you ever made fan art, written fan fiction, or designed merch? Let me know over on Instagram at School of Pop HQ or on our Substack. Make sure you're subscribed over there at schoolofpop.substack.com. I will see you there because I would love to hear your stories on this. Thanks for attending class at the School of Pop. If you enjoyed this session, please complete a course evaluation by leaving a 5-star review and share the show with a friend for extra credit. Make sure you're subscribed to School of Pop on Substack so you can get your class notes and review what we discussed today, including your homework, aka the list of references and recommendations I gave throughout this episode. That's at schoolofpop.substack.com. You can also show your school spirit by following along on Instagram at School of Pop HQ. For more pop culture fun, follow at FanFaveMedia, the home of School of Pop, the Pop Recap newsletter, and so much more. See you in class next week.
This has been a Fan Fave Media production.